is a CFRA breaking news bulletin brought to you by MAJEUR Chevrolet Cadillac.
And we had extensive coverage of all the revelations out of Toronto today. We take you now to Queen's Park and a news conference from the Auditor General of Ontario, Bonnie Lysak, on the gas-fired power plant audit.
Notwithstanding this, the OPA issued an addendum to its request for proposals that told prospective builders that in evaluating proposals, it would not consider any municipal opposition. However, as time went on, the town of Oakville was successful in blocking the construction of the plant. Barely a year after the project was awarded, the government said on October 7, 2010, that it was canceling the Oakville plant, and shortly afterwards entered into discussions with TransCanada Energy for the selection of a new plant location. In September 2012, the Minister of Energy announced that the replacement plant would be built alongside an existing Ontario power generation facility in Napanee. I'd like now to highlight some of the events that impacted the cost of the cancellation and relocation of the Oakville plant. At the time of the cancellation, the government appeared to tie its own hands by committing to keep TransCanada Energy whole, by promising to compensate it for the full financial value of the Oakville contract. This commitment came despite provisions in the contract between the OPA and TransCanada Energy that were intended to relieve both organizations of financial obligations if events beyond their control, called force majeure events, caused a delay of more than 24 months in opening the plant. Given the situation in Oakville, it could well have been possible for the OPA to simply wait it out, with no penalty at a much lower cost, if it was determined that the plant would not be able to be up and running within 24 months of the original contracted in-service date. In assuring TransCanada Energy that it would be compensated for the financial value of the contract, the Office of the Premier did not rely upon protections in the same contract that could have minimized the damages owing to TransCanada Energy. In early 2010, the OPA obtained a legal opinion indicating that cancellation of the plant may not have triggered a reimbursement to TransCanada Energy for lost profits, and may in fact have limited the OPA's liability. However, we also found indications that the government did not want to face a lawsuit, and so it offered TransCanada Energy full compensation if it agreed to lay low. After months of negotiations between the OPA and TransCanada Energy, during which time the parties failed to agree on a replacement project for Oakville, the province, the OPA, and TransCanada Energy agreed to arbitration to determine the damages to TransCanada Energy if negotiations eventually failed. The arbitration framework to which the parties agreed expressly disallowed the arbitrator from considering the possibility that TransCanada Energy would have been unable to overcome Oakville's opposition, and that the force majeure provisions of the contract would have kicked in. The arbitration framework, therefore, clearly favored TransCanada Energy and gave it the upper hand in negotiations to replace the Oakville plant. We also understand that the Ministry of Energy instructed the OPA to contract with TransCanada Energy to relocate the Oakville plant to Napanee. The OPA would have preferred Kitchener-Waterloo-Cambridge for the new plant because of high demand for power there. But negotiations with TransCanada Energy to build it in that region were unsuccessful. The OPA did not favor the Napanee site because it would cost considerably more to deliver the plant's natural gas fuel from the Sarnia hub and to transmit the electricity back to the Southwest GTA where it was most needed. As well, it was believed that power from the Napanee plant will use up transmission capacity in the Eastern Hydro Corridor that the OPA would rather have kept free for other sources of electricity, such as imports, nuclear power, and power from the existing Lennox generating station. We believe that the deal that was ultimately negotiated actually makes TransCanada Energy better than Whole, because other benefits will also accrue to TransCanada Energy above and beyond what it would have received had the plant been constructed in Oakville. For example, the OPA took on a number of costs for the Napanee plant that TransCanada Energy would have paid in Oakville, reducing TransCanada Energy's construction and operating costs for the Napanee plant by $445 million. In recognition of this, the OPA negotiated a 12% reduction in the price of electricity from the Napanee plant. However, this reduction will be worth just $275 million over 20 years, leaving TransCanada Energy with a net benefit of $170 million. As well, TransCanada Energy expected to pay $56 million to buy the Oakville site. The cost of the Napanee site is $1.1 million, resulting in an additional benefit of as much as $55 million to TransCanada Energy. Under the Napanee contract, the OPA has taken on the long-term risks associated with the costs for gas delivery, which may significantly impact the cost to electricity ratepayers in the years to come. Overall, hydro customers will be paying higher rates for electricity in the future as a result of not only the cancellation of the Oakville contract, but also of the OPA not being able to take full advantage of the terms within the Oakville contract that may well have enabled the province to get a better deal. In closing, I would like to thank the audit team and the other members of my office who worked extremely hard on this report.
And I want to know if you agree with me that this is actually a problem. I think it's a problem. Believe it or not, at the Ontario legislature, they are still having hearings into the gas plant scandal. You remember that gas plant scandal, right? $1.2 billion so the Ontario Liberal Party could buy the last election. You do remember that, right? You haven't forgotten about that, I hope. The opposition MPPs haven't, and they had a special guest at the Public Accounts Committee today. None other than the Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police, Chris Lewis. And here's the problem as I see it. $1.2 billion was stolen by the Ontario Liberal Party and handed over in secret to a couple of power companies. And when people went looking for answers, we now know there was a massive cover-up, an illegal cover-up. Tens of thousands of documents were deleted and destroyed. Hard drives were wiped clean. They tried to destroy backup tapes. In other words, insiders, some of whom were occupying some of the highest offices in the land, were perpetrating a massive cover-up. But to hear the Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police talk about it today, this is nothing but mischief. Oh, those Liberals. They're so mischievous. It's amazing. The money squandered on 2 power plants is more than the entire annual budget of the Ontario Provincial Police, and then some. And yet, by the time all is said and done, when all of this finally reaches some sort of conclusion, the perpetrators will likely not face a single day in jail, and at best the most severe sanction would be a mischief charge, according to the Commissioner of the OPP. Now, mischief in the Criminal Code of Canada, relating to the destruction of things like public documents, public data, reads like this in the Criminal Code. Everyone commits mischief who willfully destroys or alters data, renders data meaningless, useless, or ineffective, obstructs, interrupts, interferes with the lawful use of data, or obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with any person in the lawful use of data, or denies access to data to any person entitled to access thereof. We pretty much know that the Ontario Liberals did all of that. And here's the punishment. Everyone who commits mischief in relation to data is guilty of an indictable offense, liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years, that's an indictable offense, or is guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction. But let me ask, when was the last time anyone did any time in the penitentiary for mischief? I can't ever remember anyone going to jail for mischief. Chris Lewis, the OPP commissioner, was clear. He didn't want to be there today. He didn't have a lot to say. I appreciate he's in the middle of an investigation. He said he didn't want to taint anyone who might be under investigation. He didn't want to jeopardize anyone's right to a fair trial. I suppose I understand that. And he said he didn't even want to name any potential victims. So listen to this, the OPP commissioner.
I wouldn't want to identify any victims of certain offenses in investigations. For example, we would never release the name of a sexual assault victim or a domestic abuse victim, and things like children that have been victimized. But my main thought process walking into this or any similar event is that I don't disclose anything that may jeopardize the investigation. In other words, if I was to give some evidence out that I knew that may taint someone who has not been interviewed yet in terms of what evidence they will bring or what their statement would bring, that could hurt the investigation, or potentially taint potential jurors if in fact if something went to trial and it required a jury. Those are issues that are always in the forefront of my mind when I'm being interviewed by the media, or in this case. This is a rare case, to be quite honest, that I would testify anywhere during an ongoing criminal investigation. This only happened twice in 36 years for me. The other was the Orange situation. And some of our officers, of course, have had to testify the inquiry into the Elliott Lake collapse. It's a very difficult situation for us because it runs a very high risk that it's going to hurt the potential cooperation of other witnesses and maybe taint the process. Having said that, I respect the committee, and all I can do is do my best in terms of saying what I can say and what I can't.
Now, I understand. Are there any other risks that are of any particular concern to you in testifying before a committee such as this?
From a liability perspective, I wouldn't want to unfairly identify somebody who maybe had done nothing wrong and subsequently put a bad light on them. So I just have to answer honestly and consider all those little issues as I'm thinking of my answers.
OPP Commissioner Chris Lewis, if you were paying close attention there, said something very interesting at the beginning. That he doesn't want to identify any potential victims.
I wouldn't want to identify any victims of certain offenses in investigations.
He doesn't want to identify any victims. We know who the victims are of this monumental scam. We are the victims. Chris Lewis, we pay the taxes. You pay taxes in Ontario. You're a victim too. We're all victims. Anyone who lives in Ontario is a victim. Why do you think we've been having all these hearings? Why do you think we've had 2 Auditor General's reports into this scam? Why do you think the Premier resigned? The Energy Minister resigned. The Finance Minister resigned. Because they victimized us. $1.2 billion to buy a few seats in Southern Ontario, and the OPP Commissioner says at best, we're looking at a mischief charge? Doesn't want to name a victim? Well, my name is Rob Snow, and I'm a victim. Talk about trial by fire, man.
Yes.
Right into it. The figure on the low end is $675 million that you estimate to cancel this power plant in Oakville, a figure that could climb to more than $800 million. How do you arrive at these numbers?
Well, we included in here some costs that were incurred already dealing with the turbines and legal services and some sunk costs that TransCanada Energy had to put into their plant. So actual costs incurred were about $253 million. We added to that some estimated future costs associated with the building of the NASP plant. and that took us to a total cost of the cancellation of the plant to the building of the Napanee plant of about $1.1 billion. And then from that, we subtracted the estimated savings that come from the Oakville plant not being up and running, and so that came to the 675 number. And then, in addition to that, we think there's a future impact of potential tolls because the responsibility for gas delivery and distribution was taken on by the Ontario Power Authority versus TransCanada Energy.
In other words, the public, the ratepayer / taxpayer, is paying for gas deliveries that would for a pipeline that is owned by a private company.
Well, what happened when they were building the Oakville plant is that responsibility for transporting the gas was in the contract responsibility for TransCanada Energy. When it was renegotiated and it became the building of the Napanee plant, that risk was transferred to Ontario Power Authority through the negotiation process.
Is that unusual?
You know, every time you negotiate, different decisions are made, and that's just the way it ended up from a negotiation process.
The Ontario Power Authority earlier this year estimated the cost of cancelling the Oakville power plant was approximately $310 million. Yours is significantly higher, more than double. How do you account for the difference? Why is your estimate so much larger than the original estimate from the Ontario Power Authority?
Yeah, the majority of that comes from a calculation difference as well. We look at the value of the dollar, what it is worth today, the present value of the spending for the next 20 years, and we used an interest rate in our calculations of 4% because we thought that was indicative of the environment that we're operating within. The Ontario Power Authority used 6%, and so when you have a higher discount rate, that reduces the present value cost. And that's one part of the difference. The other is we assume different in-service dates for the Oakville plant and for the Napanee plant than the Ontario Power Authority used, and we're comfortable that the in-service dates we chose, reflect the appropriate, factor into the math appropriately to result in the 675 number.
It seems to me originally when the OPA approved the application for TransCanada to build this power plant in Oakville. The reason they wanted to build a plant in Oakville is that's where the need for electricity actually was, because Oakville is a very fast-growing community, suburban community of the Greater Toronto Area. It seems to me that a lot of the costs associated with the cancellation have to do with transporting natural gas, pipeline costs, transmission loss, because the plant will be in Napanee, but the electricity will actually service the southwestern part of the Greater Toronto Area. How much more is this costing the ratepayers?
I think the way you summarized it is correct. The location of the plant in Napanee it's farther from the need for the power. So there will be additional costs with respect to gas delivery, the connections, not the connections, the transmission and the line losses. And, that's part of what was negotiated in the process of leading to a contract with Napanee.
Right. No question, though, that it led to significant additional costs, however.
That's correct. The cost of building the Napanee plant now would be considered higher than what it would cost to have built the Oakville plant had it gone ahead.
Let's get into some of the other issues surrounding this report. You make the claim that not only was TransCanada made whole, it was more than made whole. What do you mean by that?
Well, we looked at what the incremental costs were in moving from canceling the plant in Oakville to building the one in Napanee, and from looking at this, we realized that TransCanada Energy will probably be making more money, more profit on this arrangement than they would have under the original agreement. Approximately $170 million of that related to the fact that the responsibilities for gas turbines, gas delivery and management, and gas and hydro connections is now being borne by Ontario Power.
The Globe and Mail suggested in its report this morning that had this contract been allowed to simply expire because deadlines would not have been met, there may have been no costs associated with not moving ahead with this project. Is there a way that could have happened, that the taxpayers would not be on the hook for anything?
Well, within the contract, there were protections both for OPA, Ontario Power Authority, as well as TransCanada Energy, and there was the condition that if the if the plant wasn't in service by the date that was contracted for, that's February 24th, 14, and was delayed more than 24 months after that date, so 2 years later, that if the plant wasn't built by, let's say, February 2016, both parties would be able to pull out of the agreement.
They could have walked away.
They could have walked away.
Right. And that would have achieved substantial savings for the ratepayers, right?
That's correct. It would have cost less than what we're seeing happening now.
Do we know how much less?
I guess again, that closing part of it would have been negotiations with respect to sunk costs and the cost of the turbines, perhaps. But right. It doesn't appear that if those clauses, were in effect in that arrangement, the plant was allowed to be built or not be built for 24 months after, then there would have been a lot savings.
Yeah. Well, the sunk costs on the turbines is about a quarter of $250 million or so, versus this figure of north of $800 million on the high side.
Yeah, well, the sunk costs are $40 million right now, and the turbines were about $210 million. So that's about $250 million of actual costs that have been incurred.
Yes.
So that could have potentially been the extent.
Let me ask you, the Privacy Commissioner investigated a different aspect of this, and that dealt with the deletion of records, the deletion of emails. How easy was it, or how forthcoming were the authorities in providing you the information that you needed in order to do your audit?
We did have full cooperation from the Ontario Power Authority and the Ministry with respect to the information that we requested.
Who made these decisions? Were these decisions made by politicians, office holders, or bureaucrats at the Ontario Power Authority? Who was calling the shots here?
I think it depends on which aspect of the decisions or what decisions. I mean, in some cases, the Ontario Power Authority made a decision, but in the majority of the cases here, it was either the Premier's office or the Minister of Energy that gave direction to the Ontario Power Authority.
The Ontario Provincial Police has launched an investigation into the destruction of records. Do you see anything criminal here? Anything that would cause you to think that there should be a criminal investigation?
With respect to the work we did in quantifying the cost of the cancellation and looking at the decisions around it, we didn't come across anything.
For the taxpayers or ratepayers of our province. $1 billion, ladies and gentlemen, for one single Liberal seat. And the worst part about that, when you read the auditor's report, is that tab is still running, with many of the costs still undetermined and the savings rather uncertain. And some Ontarians, particularly in Eastern Ontario, where I come from, are going to be forced to pay more than 50% more for natural gas prices because of the Kathleen Wynne, Dalton McGuinty government. During negotiations, it does appear that Kathleen Wynne was a great negotiator. Unfortunately, it was for TransCanada Energy, but not so much for the people of Ontario. On behalf of taxpayers across this province and my leader, Tim Hudak, I am not only appalled, but we are angry. And I wish I could say that I was surprised, but sadly I'm not. The Liberals proved totally inept at negotiating in the best interests of Ontarians. This is a government that at every turn did its best to mislead members of this Assembly and the people of the province. Emails were deleted. The OPP was brought in. Kathleen Wynne co-chaired the campaign team that made this decision. She signed the cabinet document authorizing the cancellation, and she negotiated better terms for the energy company, not for the people of our province. And she knew what we would find in the auditor's report, given what we know now. So, ladies and gentlemen, time and again, we've seen that this government simply can't be trusted with taxpayer dollars. Mr. Premier, you admitted cancelling the Oakville Gas Plant was a political decision. You told this assembly that the cost, the final price tag, would be $4 million. Her hand-picked OPA said that that number was spectacularly wrong, and it was actually $310 million. She was forced yesterday to acknowledge that, quote, the costs were unacceptably high, and then today we learned in the Globe and Mail that there would be no costs at all had it not been a political decision. So we are left to draw two conclusions, Speaker. Premier, when you signed the cabinet document cancelling the Oakville power plant, is it fair to say that you were either so far in over your head you didn't understand what those costs actually were, or did you mislead this House all along that it was more important?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, I will just be clear once again that how we got here. Our government, the government, listened to the advice of experts, cited two power plants over the objections of local residents, which was something that shouldn't have happened, Mr. Speaker. Over time, it became evident that the concerns of the residents were, in fact, legitimate, and we needed to make a change. The government listened to those concerns, canceled the power plants for relocation elsewhere. Everyone agreed, the PCs agreed, the NDP agreed, Mr. Speaker. The estimates of the cost varied, but, Mr. Speaker, all of them, and I've said this, were unacceptably high, that money should not have been spent in that way. Everything, though, that we did, Mr. Speaker, in the run-up to and in the process of cancelling was, the advice that we got was that if we had waited longer, that it could have been much more expensive. So that is the reality of what was happening at that time.
A government without credibility certainly has no legitimacy, and this government has lost all credibility on the Oakville Gas Plant cancellation and in their entire long-term energy plan. It is clear that the Premier has told us false numbers in this House all along. The Premier has admitted